Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I just came across a new study yesterday that I thought I would link down below for you guys. And it has to do with protein intake in middle-aged men and older men and hip fractures, and actually just fractures in general. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing. Let's do a little bit of crafting and let's talk about that, because this has been an important point. And this is one of these points that comes up in the fitness world only because there is such a large vegan population in the online fitness world. And I actually had to step back and ask that myself, why are there so many here? Why are they so influential? And then I realized, because veganism is generally a fitness-oriented lifestyle. Most people become vegan because they want to improve their fitness. They tend to be, as a demographic, fitness conscious. And I think most of us understand that. They are fitness conscious as a demographic. Even though they only make up 0.5% of the American population, or about 1 million people in the U.S., you got to figure there's only probably a few million at most very serious fitness enthusiasts in the U.S. also. And I'm going to assume we're going to see different breakdowns of demographics around first world countries, or at least English-speaking countries who would be watching a lot of these main YouTube channels. The only thing that I dislike there is that a lot of them, they refuse to look at anything it's a different viewpoint from their own, and they want to cherry pick data. And so you see a study like this come out, it kind of is contradicting, because this looked at thousands of men. They had a pretty good number of men to draw from to look at these numbers. And it kind of goes against what you see with a lot of like vegan experts and nutritionists have tried to say in the past. And you know, guys, I've watched all of that. People need to remember that I did some serious research into all of this years ago, because I did dabble in veganism for a while. So I actually researched what all of these experts were saying. I know who all these various people are. I know about the Dean Ornish diet. I know about the Pritikin diet. I know about all these things. I've actually listened to these experts speak. I've read their writings. I'm familiar with these people. Dr. Campbell even. So it's not like I'm not familiar with what they're saying. And one of the things a lot of them tried to point out is that osteoporosis is caused by animal protein, which, you know, should lead to higher hip fracture rates and stuff. Well, the truth is, this study did kind of look at multiple variants. There was multivariate analysis done, and they've used the models for that. They explained the models there of how they actually took these numbers and tried to account for the other variables. What other variables do I mean that account for osteoporosis? Your age, how physically active you are, if you smoke, how much alcohol you drink, if you take vitamin D, if you take a calcium supplement, things like that were factored in to try to balance these variables out, to understand that, you know, this could skew the numbers. If you had one group more than the other who is more prone to these things, then obviously those are going to be other factors. Meaning, if you had a group that ate less protein but drank a lot of alcohol, several individuals, those individuals could skew the numbers. So they had to account for these things, and they tried to do that in their analysis. So this is an attempt at multivariate analysis, looking at over 5,000 individuals to try to draw data from. And what they found was that people who consumed higher protein intakes had lower rates of hip fracture. Furthermore, that those who consumed animal source protein in the form of dairy, or they put it as non-dairy animal protein, which is generally going to mean meat, that they had even lower rates of hip fractures. All right, so what that means is that protein intake, it was strongly correlated. And again, they found that it was less correlated with plant source protein than it was with animal source protein. Now, what that means is that there is a correlation there. The argument could be made that, okay, does this mean that animal protein is protective? Does it increase bone density? What's going on here? And that's a more difficult question to answer because you've got to have causation to do that. And that's the problem we run into. We could say these things are correlated. And the interesting point with the correlation is not to show that animal protein is automatically protective against hip fractures and osteoarthritic fractures, or whatever they're called. I forget the exact term. I'm sure there'll be a medical doctor who will slip in here and correct me. It's not to prove that, because that's not what you're looking at. You're looking for correlation here. Because this was, again, multivariate analysis done, but this was epidemiology. It's very difficult to draw causation from epidemiology. And I don't think that they tried to do that with this research. They were looking at different types of protein intake to see how it correlated with hip fracture, because this is an important point, because you do see a lot of people out there, again, particularly vegans, who try to claim that animal protein causes osteoporosis, and if it causes osteoporosis, it should cause bone mineralization, and they claim that this has to do with some of the acidic effects of it and having to pull calcium from the bones to like deal with the phosphorus load and everything else involved with it. And that's an interesting hypothesis, but the thing is, if that was true, we should see that reflected in this data, and we didn't. All right, we didn't see it reflected in the data. But again, we're not looking for causation here, but you can use correlation to say, okay, if there's a hypothetical causation, then that hypothetical causation should be seen in the correlation of the data. You can go the other direction, meaning you can take something you to believe to be causation, and if that causation is real, you should be able to see it in the correlational data, meaning if lightning strikes cause people to die through electrocution, you should be able to see it the other direction, that a very high percentage of people who are hit with lightning strikes died of electrocution more than the general population. I'm not saying it totally that way, but you guys get the idea. You're dealing with causation here. You don't go the other way. You can't say correlation is then causation, because in this case, we're only seeing the correlation. They did some multivariate analysis, which helps. It helps a lot with looking at causation. And that's where you get closer to saying, okay, is there some protective benefits to higher protein, particularly higher animal protein? All right, is there something going on here? That's how you do it, but it's not enough to say, okay, it's definitely there, because you can't with this sort of data. But you can go the other way and say, if there was causation on the other one, then why is it correlated the other direction? It shouldn't work that way. If osteoporosis is caused by animal protein, then people who consume the highest animal protein diets should have higher rates of osteoporosis and hip fracture, not lower like we saw here. So there's a problem with their hypothesis. Their hypothesis isn't looking too good. Now, when you look at this and say, okay, Jason, what do you mean? Why wouldn't it be protective? If the data is there, then how come you can't? Well, because you only have 5,000 people. And yeah, they did multivariate analysis, but maybe there's more going on there. Maybe people who consume a little more animal protein as they get older, which we know this, have less muscle wasting. Maybe they have a little more muscle mass, irrespective of their exercise. All right? Irrespective of their exercise. Well, more muscle mass might mean that in their physical activity, they do a little more load-bearing stuff. They're more likely to pick up something heavy and move it, more likely to carry in the groceries every day as men get older, right? So if they're doing that, isn't that load-bearing and protective against osteoporosis through physical activity that we're not looking at? Because we're looking at their exercise, but what about the men who don't exercise? Maybe the more muscle from the more protein just means that they're more physically active and more likely to pick up things that weigh something and move it. That could also account for the lower hip fractures and lower osteoporosis, right? It doesn't mean that the protein itself helped in any way. Not directly, it would be an indirect effect. And it actually turns out that load-bearing exercise, even when it's not exercise, it's daily activity, protects against osteoporosis. And the men are just picking up heavier loads because they have a little more muscle. It could be something as simple as that. So we don't want to draw conclusions that aren't there. We don't want to jump up and say, aha, eating a steak every day will prevent osteoporosis, because that's not what this data is saying. And people need to understand that difference when we're looking at correlation. And always remind people of that. The best thing I ever had a professor say to me, explaining correlation does not equal causation, he said, you know, we had studies years ago that showed that the more kitchen appliances that a family had in their household, the lower the rate of teenage pregnancy. So we saw a correlation with fewer kitchen appliances in their home with teen pregnancy. So if we were to try to make correlation equal causation, in that case, we would look at that and say, not having appliances in your kitchen causes your daughters to get pregnant. Well, we know that that's absurd. Common sense says that's absurd. Do you know what it actually turned out to be? That people who have more appliances in their kitchen are more affluent and make more money. The more appliances in your kitchen, the more likely it is that you make more money. More money is usually correlated with better education. Also more correlated with families who are going to spend money on birth control for their teenage daughters rather than just tell them no. Therefore, households that have more appliances in the kitchen have more girls who are all being put on birth control by their parents because they can afford it. And that lowered the pregnancy rate. So you've got to remember that correlation does not equal causation. But the study was interesting, and I felt it was worth noting because, again, we're going to talk about diet, we're going to talk about fitness and health, protein intake, and osteoporosis, two big serious topics. I mean, if there is a link between your protein intake and whether you get osteoporosis up in your 50s, which is, again, causes your bones to break easier, causes your hips to break, then this is a worthy topic. Because none of us want to experience that. We all work out and lift weights and do things so that we can be strong and fit as we get older, right? None of us want to be weak, frail, old men and women. That's not anyone's goal here. I would assume that anyone who's into fitness, watching a channel about weightlifting and fitness, has no desire to be frail and weak and fragile when they get older. So I thought this study was interesting in light of that. And I thought it was interesting because it does break down one of the common arguments I do see vegans come and make in my comment section about some of this stuff. Anytime we talk about protein intake. And people need to remember, I am not one of the people promoting ultra high protein intakes out there. I don't believe in it. I don't think it's necessary for gaining muscle. I think high protein intake is useful, but not ultra high, not what most other people out there are recommending. So we're dealing with slightly different channels here. For vegans who are coming over hearing this and thinking I'm one of these guys telling people to eat 200 or 300 grams of protein a day, I'm not doing that. So just making that clear. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.